I mean, because we always treat these ancient texts like they're just compilations of myths,
Right, yeah.
like bedtime stories about kings who got too arrogant, or magic spells, or these highly dramatic cosmic events where the sky literally falls down.
Exactly, the whole fire and brimstone thing.
Yeah, and we read them with the same part of our brain that we use for fairy tales or fantasy novels. But then you read this specific lecture, this breakdown by Aloma Parwez, and he completely flips the table.
He really does.
He is making this incredibly striking assertion about the Quran, specifically looking at Surah 41, verses 13 through 25. And he says that 1,400 years ago, this text wasn't trying to give us supernatural ghost stories or theological threats. It was establishing history as an exact empirical science of history.
And that paradigm shift is, well, it's the entire foundation of his analysis. Parwez strips away all that supernatural framing that people reflexively project onto these texts.
Which is hard to do, honestly.
Very hard. But when he approaches this specific passage, he argues that the text is treating human history as a sociological blueprint. It's proposing that human societies are governed by immutable cause and effect laws.
Like physics.
Exactly like physics, operating with the same cold mathematical precision as the laws of biology or gravity.
I want to really sit with that for a second, because to claim history is an empirical science 14 centuries ago is a massive statement.
Oh, absolutely.
We typically credit modern thinkers for that. We look at Edward Gibbon's massive volumes on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, where he didn't just list the emperors, he actually analyzed the systemic rot.
Right, the inflation, the corruption of the Praetorian Guard.
Yeah, the breakdown in civic duty.
Mm-hmm.
Or we look at Hegel or Arnold Toynbee, who mapped out the life cycles of civilizations. But Parwez is arguing that this text beat them to the punch by over a millennium.
And not only beat them to the punch, but laid out the methodology explicitly. I mean, Parwez points out that the text is asking you, the reader, to act like a structural diagnostician.
Okay, unpack that a bit. What does that look like?
Well, when the passage points to the ruins of ancient civilizations, the crumbled pillars in the desert, the lost cities, it isn't saying, look at what happens when a deity gets angry and hurls lightning bolts.
It's not a divine temper tantrum.
Exactly. It is presenting empirical case studies. It's saying, examine the data. These destroyed societies adopted a specific, flawed socioeconomic system, and the destruction you see is just the unavoidable structural result of that system.
Parwez uses this brilliant analogy of agriculture to make this concrete, which I love. He says, look at the physical world. If you want to harvest, there is a science to it.
Yes, the seed and the soil.
Right, you need a specific seed, you need fertile soil, you have to water it, and you have to protect it from pests. And if you follow those physical laws of agriculture, one seed yields 100 grains. It is a biological inevitability.
It just happens.
But you can't plant a scone, pray over it for a month, and expect wheat to grow. The universe doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about the biological mechanism.
And Parwez applies that exact ironclad causality to human societies. The socioeconomic structure a nation adopts is the seed. The political climate is the soil.
So if you plant a bad seed,
If a society plants a seed of structural inequality or systemic oppression, the inevitable harvest is civilizational collapse. It isn't a mystical punishment, it is the biological outcome of the socioeconomic seed that was sown.
I have to challenge this strict cause and effect idea, though. Let's really stress test this framework.
Sure, let's do it.
Because if human history is just empirical science, and a flawed economic system is as predictably destructive as planting a stone instead of a seed, how does Parwez account for bad actors who win for centuries?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, because we see highly oppressive, incredibly unequal societies that survive and even thrive for hundreds of years. If the laws are as strict as gravity, why doesn't the branch break immediately? Why doesn't the civilization collapse the moment it institutes an unjust law?
That tension is crucial to understand. And Parwez addresses this by looking at the timeline of structural rot and the concept of systemic latency.
Systemic latency.
Right. An empire can run on the fumes of its previous structural integrity for generations, or it can temporarily offset its internal decay by outsourcing its suffering.
Like through imperialism.
Exactly. Extracting resources from other nations to prop up a failing domestic system, but the internal rot is still accumulating mathematically. To use a structural engineering metaphor, if you build a skyscraper with substandard steel, it doesn't collapse the day you cut the ribbon.
No, it looks fine. Everyone applauds.
Right. It might stand for decades. People might marvel at it. But the microfractures in the steel are spreading. The collapse is latent, but it is mathematically guaranteed the moment a specific stress threshold is reached.
It's insidious because an earthquake is an external physical event, right? It hits, it destroys, it's over. But this kind of systemic collapse is a society destroying itself from the inside out, atom by atom.
It's structural suicide.
The society is building its nest on a fragile, rotting branch. The fall isn't an external attack. It's the structural consequence of building on a foundation that simply cannot bear the weight of human existence.
And the latency of the collapse is often what lulls these societies into a false sense of security. They look at their temporary survival and assume the laws of causality don't apply to them.
They think they beat the system.
Yes. They mistake the delay of consequence for the absence of consequence.
Which perfectly explains why societies fail to correct course. If the consequences aren't instantaneous, people invent alternate explanations for their success or failure. And that brings up this fascinating psychological layer in Parwez's analysis.
The shift from childhood to adulthood.
Exactly, the shift from humanity's societal childhood to its rational adulthood. Because if we aren't experiencing instant, undeniable karma, our brains try to fill the gap with magic.
Parwez argues that in the early stages of human history, society was essentially in its intellectual infancy, and children operate on sensory spectacle. They want magic.
They want the light show.
Right. They are entertained by fairy tales, flying objects, genies, and supernatural interventions. When early childhood societies looked for validation of a truth, they demanded a sensory miracle. They wanted a mountain to turn to gold, or a stick to turn into a snake.
Or someone to fly through the air.
Exactly.
And it's the ultimate abdication of responsibility when you think about it. If God fixes the problem with a miracle, I don't have to change my zoning laws. I don't have to audit my tax codes.
You don't have to do the hard work.
Right. I don't have to figure out how to equitably distribute water rights. We just wait for the mountain to turn to gold, and our deficit is miraculously solved.
And that abdication of agency is the core symptom of an immature intellect. Parwez asserts that this specific Quranic text addresses humanity in its intellectual maturity.
In its adulthood.
Yes. An adult intellect cannot rely on magic or sensory tricks to understand the world. It must rely on reason, observation, and structural laws. The text actively rejects the demand for miracles, because relying on miracles is a refusal to engage with the actual mechanics of reality.
It's actually deeply uncomfortable to look at it this way, because it strips away all our excuses.
It really does.
And Parwez is incredibly sharp in his critique of how people still cling to these childish superstitions today. I mean, we might have smartphones and quantum computers, but psychologically, we are still waiting for the magic trick.
Oh, absolutely. The astrology, the lucky charms.
He talks about how people wait for auspicious days to start a business, or fear unlucky days. He mentions the cultural baggage of considering Tuesdays or Saturdays as ominous, or refusing to start medical treatments on certain days because the planetary alignment is wrong.
It is the total outsourcing of human agency to inanimate objects. I mean, if you connect your society's destiny to the movement of planets, if you think your economic success is dependent on whether a star is in a certain astrological house, or if a particular day of the week is inherently unlucky, you have abandoned rational action.
You've given up the steering wheel.
Exactly. You are no longer navigating the sea. You have simply let go of the rudder.
He even points out the absurdity of highly educated individuals, people with advanced degrees, people who run corporations, who will completely ignore a sound, rational economic argument, but will flock to a guru or a mystic who claims to perform parlor tricks.
It's bizarre, but it happens all the time.
He literally uses the example of someone claiming to pull milk out of a tuft of hair. We'd rather believe in the guy doing parlor tricks than the person laying out a grueling, multi-decade plan for infrastructure reform.
Because the parlor trick demands absolutely no systemic change from the observer.
Wow, yeah.
It entertains the intellect without burdening the conscience. Parwez is arguing that a society that relies on superstition, lucky days, and magic is structurally paralyzed. It cannot innovate, cannot course correct, and it cannot survive a real crisis because it fundamentally believes its fate is out of its own hands.
Okay, so if we are firmly in this adult era and destruction isn't a supernatural lightning bolt, and we can no longer blame our poverty on an unlucky Tuesday, then the consequences of our actions must be strictly empirical. We can't rely on the imagery of fire and brimstone opening up the earth. So how does Parwez mathematically define the societal punishment. What does the collapse actually look like in real time?
This is where Parwez's socio-economic translation of the text becomes incredibly relevant. He dissects the Arabic term adhab, which traditionally gets flattened into the English words punishment or torment.
Which usually carries that fire and brimstone connotation.
Exactly. But Parwez looks at the specific qualifiers attached to that word in the passage, adhab al-kizi and adhab al-han.
Let's unpack the mechanics of those two terms for the listener, because they move the concept of hell from the afterlife directly into the present socioeconomic reality.
So kizi translates to humiliation, disgrace, or degradation, and han translates to weakness, fragility, or a profound enfeeblement.
Okay.
Parwez argues that the ultimate structural consequence for a corrupt society isn't a physical crater in the ground. It happens in the fabric of their daily existence. The punishment is the state of a nation that becomes fundamentally weak and humiliated on the global stage.
So it isn't a sudden cinematic explosion. It's the slow, agonizing reality of losing sovereignty.
Yes. It is the condition of a society that can no longer sustain itself. A society that has to constantly ask for external bailouts, that relies on foreign aid to feed its own citizens, that lives in perpetual fear of larger nations dictating its foreign and domestic policy.
It's the psychological state where the citizens feel a deep internal sense of inferiority.
Absolutely.
Think about what that looks like on the ground for you. When two people from that society meet at a coffee shop, their first conversation is about how doomed they are.
Right, a shared cultural depression.
Exactly. They talk about how their currency is worthless, how they are at the mercy of international monetary funds, how their brightest minds are all fleeing to other countries. That psychological and economic degradation, that utter lack of dignity, that is the adhab al-kizi.
And that dependency becomes a trap. Parwez notes how foreign powers might drop a few crumbs into the begging bowl of the weakened nation. They provide just enough aid to keep the society from utterly collapsing into anarchy, but strategically, never enough to let them build their own industries and stand on their own 2 feet.
And the tragic part is the complacency that sets in. The leadership of the weakened nation gets the crumbs, they secure the loan, and they hold a press conference saying, look, we are saved. We avoided default.
Well, Parwez is saying, no, that dependency is the destruction.
Yes.
You haven't avoided the punishment. You are living inside it. That perpetual indignity is what societal hell looks like in the here and now.
That dependency is exactly why Parwez turns his critique toward the foreign powers, dropping those crumbs. He analyzes the mindset of the dominant civilizations mentioned in the text, the superpowers of their day, who boldly declared, who is stronger than us in power?
Who is stronger than us? It's the ultimate hubris.
It really is. It's the declaration that physics and causality no longer apply to us because our military budget is simply too large.
It is the mindset of a superpower that believes its sheer physical, economic, or military might grants it the right to dictate the terms of reality to the rest of the world. And Parwez introduces a critical structural concept here, which is the act of imposing a system, biher al-haq.
Let's break down haq. It's a dense term.
Very dense. Haq fundamentally means truth, objective justice, or that which is inherently right and beneficial. It is the structural anchor of reality.
Okay.
So to operate biher al-haq means to establish dominance and enforce systems purely by coercive force, entirely detached from universal justice or human benefit.
The institutionalization of the might makes right philosophy. I mean, if I have the aircraft carriers or if I control the global banking reserve currency, I get to write the rules.
And you write the rules specifically to ensure that you stay at the top and everyone else stays at the bottom.
Exactly.
Parwez argues that any global or national system built purely on force is structurally doomed. If a superpower's primary goal is merely containment, ensuring no other power rises to challenge them, rather than competing to see who can provide more universal benefit to humanity, they are violating a fundamental sociological law.
Because the earth belongs to what benefits people.
According to Parwez's reading, yes, the earth structurally belongs to that which benefits humanity most. A system built on biher al-haq is fighting the sociological equivalent of gravity. Eventually, the sheer cost of maintaining that artificial dominance exhausts the superpower from within.
Now, Parwez doesn't just keep this abstract or historical. He acts like a diagnostician looking at an MRI of human governance, and he applies this lens to the specific economic engines we live under today.
He takes a very hard look at unchecked capitalism.
He does. And the metaphor he uses to explain the mechanism of this failure is incredibly vivid. It's the image of rain falling on a mountainous landscape.
The topographical metaphor perfectly captures the physics of capital accumulation.
Right. So he says, imagine a heavy rain falling on the peaks in the high ground of a mountain range. The natural law of gravity ensures that the water doesn't stay up there, nor does it distribute evenly across the slopes.
Gravity pulls all that water down into the lowest valley.
And once it's in the valley, it just pools. It stagnates. Parwes likens this to generational wealth hoarding under unchecked capitalism. The wealth of a society doesn't circulate. The economic gravity of the system pulls it all into the hands of a tiny elite at the bottom of the valley.
To understand the how behind this, Parwes focuses heavily on the mechanism of inheritance and compounding capital. He isn't necessarily critiquing the initial act of earning.
Right, it's not anti-work.
No, he is critiquing the structural pooling. A massive accumulation of capital occurs, and through inheritance, it is passed down to heirs who did nothing to generate that value. They just won the biological lottery.
And once that pool of capital is large enough, it generates its own gravitational field. Money magnetically attracts more money. The large capital swallows the small capital. The megacorporation buys out the 100 independent businesses on the slopes.
And the systemic danger here is the cessation of movement. When wealth pools in the valley, the velocity of money, the actual lifeblood of a functioning economy, grinds to a halt.
The slopes dry up.
The slopes where the majority of the population lives dry up completely. The economic body becomes paralyzed because all the blood has rushed to a single organ.
It's a brilliant way to explain why the system fails. It isn't just a moral failing of the people in the valley, it's a mechanical failure of the societal engine.
It's physics again.
Exactly. But if the capitalist pooling of wealth is a failure, and the superpower ruling by force is a failure, what about our modern political solutions? How does Parwes look at the way we determine who gets to govern?
He takes a very hard, critical look at what he terms flawed numerical democracy, which he actually traces back to ancient tribalism.
Let's follow that logic, because it's fascinating. If we aren't using force, and we aren't using wealth, we usually fall back on numbers, a head count.
Right. Parwes asks us to examine how we define right and wrong in statecraft. In ancient tribal dynamics, a tribe's right to rule the valley was based purely on their numbers. If my tribe has 5,000 spears and yours has 2,000, my tribe dictates the laws.
It was a crude head count determining morality.
And we look back at that and think we've evolved so far beyond it because we use ballots instead of spears.
Right, we have voting booths now.
But Parwes argues that relying merely on a numerical majority, say 51% of a population dictating terms to 49% of a population without any anchor in objective universal justice, is just a modernized, sanitized version of that ancient tribal mob rule.
This is a huge point. If a system is just a head count, and 51% of the population votes to legally cannibalize the resources of the 49%, the system is functioning perfectly according to democratic mechanics. But it is structurally evil.
It is a mathematical tyranny. That is precisely why Parwes insists the foundation of society must be objective justice. If the legislative foundation isn't rooted in universal human rights and sustenance, then a parliament or a Congress is just a sophisticated mechanism for a larger mob to subjugate a smaller mob.
Just because more people voted for it doesn't make it right.
The number of people in the room voting for an unjust policy does not magically transform it into a just policy.
Okay, so if Parwes rejects defining a society's success by the size of its majority or the wealth of its elite, how does he measure it? If wealth is pooling in the valley and the 51% are busy subjugating the 49%, that means there are massive populations on the drying slopes who are completely falling through the cracks.
Inevitably, yes.
How does the text categorize the people who are ground up by these massive systems?
This brings us to some of the most profound linguistic and sociological re-engineering in Parwes's entire lecture. He focuses on two very common Arabic words found throughout the Quranic text, yatim and miskin.
Now, in standard translations, these usually just mean orphan and poor person, right? It evokes a very specific, almost Victorian image of charity. You give a child a bowl of soup, you toss a coin to a beggar, and your moral duty is complete.
That traditional translation completely domesticates the terms. Parwes strips away that sentimental charity model and digs into the linguistic roots to extract their structural sociological meaning. Let's start with the yatim.
Traditionally, an orphan.
Right. But the root of the word implies someone who is left completely alone, severed from their support structure.
It's not just about losing biological parents.
Not at all. In the context of a massive, complex socio-economic system, a yatim is any individual who is socially isolated and politically unrepresented. It is the person who has no tribe, no union, no lobbyist, and no political party to back them up.
That reframes everything. You could be a 45-year-old adult living in a modern megacity of 10 million people, and you are a sociological yatim.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Think about a modern gig economy worker for you listening right now. They have no collective bargaining power, no healthcare safety net, no institutional protection. If they get crushed by the algorithm or the economic machine, absolutely no one is coming to help them. They are entirely alone in a crowd of millions.
That isolation is the hallmark of the yatim. The crime of the feeling civilization isn't just that they didn't fund an orphanage, it's that their entire metric of human dignity is based on the size of your group or the leverage of your wealth. If you are an individual standing alone, the system strips you of your dignity. You are invisible because you cannot exert force.
And what about the miskeen? The traditional translation is poor or destitute. How does Parwez elevate that into a systemic critique?
He looks at the root word, which denotes a lack of motion, a stillness, or being stuck.
Like the word for static or paralyzed.
Yes, the miskeen is a person whose economic and social movement has been totally paralyzed. Parwez paints a very specific operational picture here. The miskeen is not someone who is lazy. This is not someone who is refusing to participate in the economy.
They aren't just sitting at home.
No, this is a person who is out in the dirt, covered in dust, working grueling labor from dawn until dusk, but the structure of the economy guarantees they will never advance.
It's like a gear in an engine that has been entirely stripped of its teeth. It is spinning furiously all day long, absorbing all the heat and friction, doing the hardest physical movement, but it is completely incapable of moving the vehicle forward. The structure of the transmission ensures the gear's effort is wasted.
That stripped gear metaphor is exact. The miskeen's wages are mathematically designed to barely cover their daily caloric survival. The system leaves zero margin for savings, for investment, for education, or for upward mobility. Their economic trajectory is artificially flatlined by the very system they are powering.
So when Parwez says these ancient superpowers collapse because they neglected the yatim and the miskeen, it's a radical shift in blame. He's not talking about individuals failing to put a few dollars in a charity box on the weekend.
Not at all.
He's identifying a catastrophic systemic failure where the society deliberately isolated its vulnerable individuals and permanently paralyzed its working class to keep the wealth pooling in the valley.
And returning to the premise of a science of history, this is why the destruction of those societies is inevitable. A structural engineer will tell you that a building cannot survive if it actively pulverizes its own foundation.
You can't drill holes in your own floor.
By paralyzing the working class and isolating the individual, the society destroys its own base. The collapse isn't divine anger, it's physics.
Okay, if that's the failure, if capitalism pearls the wealth, if democracy can devolve into mob rule, and if the working class is paralyzed, what is the structural fix?
Because we can't just stop at the critique.
Well, Porwis doesn't just leave us staring at the ruins.
Yeah.
He outlines the Quran's alternative model. He calls it the Aqaba.
The Aqaba. The steep path. The metaphor of the steep path is highly intentional and serves as a reality check against utopian thinking.
Because everyone wants the solution to be a flat, newly paved, downhill highway. We want to say a few inspirational words, hold an ice ceremony, pass a single symbolic law, and declare the society healed.
But the Aqaba implies arduous, uphill, systemic restructuring. It takes breath, stamina, and relentless, agonizing effort to climb a mountain. It demands structural sacrifice from those currently sitting comfortably in the valley.
So what does climbing that mountain actually entail? How does Parwez break down the mechanics of the Aqaba? He identifies 3 structural pillars required to build a rational, just society.
Yes, the first pillar is Fakr Kaba. Linguistically, it translates to freeing the neck.
Historically, that was a direct injunction to free slaves, right?
Yes, but Parwez extracts the universal mechanism. In any era, in any economic paradigm, Fakr Kaba means the active structural dismantling of all forms of systemic subjugation.
Freeing the neck from any yoke.
It is the absolute mandate to free individuals from being crushed under the economic, political, or social yoke of others. A society hasn't taken its very first step on the steep path until it stops people from being subjugated by monopolies, coercive labor practices, or oppressive state surveillance.
It's the total rejection of Big Hair al-Haq. You can't just be a kinder, gentler slave master. You can't just offer your paralyzed gig workers a slightly better break room. You have to break the yoke entirely. You have to grant them structural autonomy.
Exactly.
But let's deduce the next logical problem. Okay, so Fakr Akaba frees people from the yoke. But a politically free person can still starve to death in the street. Freedom is useless without physical sustenance. Does Parwez address immediate biological survival in this system?
He does, and it forms the second pillar. It is the absolute eradication of hunger, specifically highlighted during times of crisis or famine. And Parwez highlights a terrifyingly strict empirical metric here.
I remember this part. It's intense.
If even a single individual in a society goes to sleep hungry, that entire society structurally loses its right to security.
A single individual. Let's really process that for a moment. That is a radically uncompromising standard.
Wow.
In modern governance, we look at a city with thousands of homeless and hungry people sleeping under overpasses, but we look at the stock market, we see the GDP is up 3%, and the leadership says the economy is booming, we are doing great.
Parvez is saying that under the laws of the Aqaba, if one person is starving, your entire socio-economic contract is null and void.
It's broken.
You forfeit any claim to systemic protection because the state has failed its most basic existential function. It completely reorients the purpose of governance. The primary KPI, the key performance indicator of a state, is not gross accumulation of wealth. It is the absolute guarantee of basic human sustenance for every single unit in that society.
And that leads naturally to the third pillar, which directly addresses the marginalized groups we talked about.
Exactly. The active integration and uplifting of the yatim and the miskin.
Bringing the isolated back into the social fabric and unfreezing the paralyzed gear.
And you don't achieve this by dropping charity coins in their begging bowl, because as we noted with the concept of Kizi, charity without structural change just perpetuates their humiliation.
It keeps them at the bottom of the valley.
You have to change the system so the yatim has a political voice. You have to restructure the economy so the miskin has actual mobility and a share of the value they produce. You have to build a societal engine where wealth is actively pumped back uphill rather than just passively pooling in the valley.
This all sounds incredibly rigorous, but also very theoretical. How does a society actually execute this? This brings us to a fascinating historical model Parwez uses. He reinterprets the story of Noah's Ark.
Oh, this is brilliant.
And this completely shatters the childhood mindset of waiting for miracles.
It is the perfect encapsulation of moving from magical thinking to rational material action.
When we think of Noah in the traditional fairy tale sense, we think of a guy who was chosen because he was righteous. So when the flood comes, God just magically saves him.
Right, a magical bubble.
But Parwez points out that Noah didn't just sit on a rock, fold his hands, and pray for a magical, invisible force field to protect him from the rising water.
The divine mandate wasn't just to pray. The mandate was to build a physical, material ship. Noah had to act as an engineer. He had to source the wood, measure the planks, apply the pitch to make it waterproof, and construct an enormous piece of infrastructure.
Because the physics of a flood don't care about your internal piety. The water doesn't care how righteous you are if you don't have a boat. The laws of buoyancy and displacement apply to the saint and the sinner equally.
That is the core lesson Parwez extracts. If Noah had just prayed and failed to do the grueling material work of building the ship, he would have drowned with everyone else. Righteousness in the adult era of humanity isn't expecting the laws of physics to bend around you. Righteousness is understanding those laws and doing the hard material work of preparation.
So translate that from a wooden boat to a modern society. A rationally governed society must proactively build its own socio-economic ships to survive inevitable crises. An economic recession is a flood. A global pandemic is a flood. A supply chain collapse is a flood. You can't just hope for the best or wait for the market to magically self-correct.
You need infrastructure. You need equitable resource distribution networks. You need a healthcare system with excess capacity that can handle a massive surge. You need strategic agricultural reserves. Those are your planks, your nails, and your pitch.
If you haven't built those socioeconomic ships before the rain starts, your society will drown. The ruins of those ancient civilizations that the Quran points to, those are the remains of people who saw the storm clouds gathering, heard the warnings, but refused to build a ship. They just assumed they were too economically powerful to fail, or they hoped for a magical intervention that never came.
And the flood took them all.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together into our final synthesis. We are looking at a deeply structural, cause and effect universe. Parwez argues the Quran advocates for a rationally governed, economically just society. No magic, no exceptions for superpowers, no lucky days.
None of it.
But here is the ultimate question of enforcement. If a corrupt system is really, really good at hiding its internal rot, if the elite in the valley control the media, if they fudge the economic data, if they pass laws to silence whistleblowers, how does the causality actually catch up to them? How is the accounting finalized?
This leads to Parwez's final and perhaps most profound interpretation of the text. He addresses the mechanism of accountability. There is a deeply evocative image in the Quranic text regarding the day of reckoning, where it says that a person's own eyes, ears, and limbs will testify against them.
And normally, again, we read that like a surreal fantasy novel. You imagine a literal hand growing a mouth and talking in a courtroom.
Right, which sounds absurd to a modern mind.
But Parwez takes this out of the realm of the supernatural and applies it to systems theory.
He breaks down the philosophical concept of the human entity. He notes that there's the physical body, the eyes, the ears, the hands, and then there's the inner core, the directing intelligence, or the eye, which in Arabic is termed the nafs.
The nafs, okay.
The physical body is merely an instrument, a dumb terminal used by the nafs to enact its will upon the world.
Right. If my brain says steal that object, my hand just obeys the command. The hand is just the physical hardware. The nafs is the software giving the order.
Now, Parwez asks us to apply this macro-sociologically to a whole society or a nation state.
Yeah.
What is the inner core, the nafs, of a society?
Oh, wow.
It is the leadership, the foundational ideology, the policymakers, the hidden intentions of the ruling class. And what are the limbs, the eyes, hands, and feet? They are the physical institutions, the state apparatus, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure, and the working class itself.
Okay, I see where this is going, and it is a staggering way to look at reality. When the text says your limbs will testify against you, what does that mean for a modern nation state?
It means systemic corruption cannot be hidden indefinitely. The ruling elite, the nafs of the society, might think they are operating in the dark. They might think their PR campaigns have completely covered up their wealth hoarding or their injustice. But the consequences of those hidden decisions have to be physically executed by the apparatus of the society.
And the limbs feel it.
And those actions leave physical, undeniable scars on the limbs.
The infrastructure physically absorbs the corruption.
Exactly. When a system's core is corrupt, its limbs rot. The bridges crumble because the contracting funds were embezzled. The public schools fail because the tax base was hollowed out to protect the valley. The bureaucracy grinds to a halt because it is choked with nepotism and inefficiency. The physical and mental health of the paralyzed Miskeen population visibly declines.
So the elite might stand at a podium in their tailored suits, pointing to a fabricated chart, declaring everything is fine, the economy is stronger than ever.
But the limbs tell the truth.
But the crumbling institutions, the very limbs of the society, are visibly, undeniably testifying against them. A pothole isn't just a pothole. It is the physical testimony of a depleted tax base and a corrupt system. The physical reality of the state exposes the rot of the inner core.
It is the inescapability of consequence. You cannot bribe the laws of physics, and you cannot censor the decay of your own infrastructure.
Wow.
A corrupt socio-economic foundation inherently and visibly destroys itself. The limbs themselves bear witness to the disease, rendering all the PR and propaganda utterly useless.
It's a closed loop. We are all living inside a civilizational equation that is slowly, methodically balancing itself out. And if you are on the wrong side of the equal sign, if you are structurally isolating the yatim, if you are paralyzing the miskeen, if you are hoarding the water in the valley and ruling purely by force without hack, the equation will eventually reduce your society to zero.
And that is Parwez's vision of the science of history. It isn't a collection of myths. It isn't a plea for magic. It is the terrifying, beautiful precision of cause and effect playing out over centuries.
If human societies operate on laws of causality, as strict and unforgiving as the laws of gravity. Wait, no. If they operate on laws of causality as strict and unforgiving as the laws of gravity, what socioeconomic ships are we entirely failing to build today, simply because we're waiting for a magical solution to fall from the sky?